I was not always what I am now. There was a time when I had a name, a face that belonged to me alone, hands that moved at my command. I remember the weight of my own thoughts, the sensation of breathing air that had not been filtered through a dozen recycling systems, the simple pleasure of closing my eyes and finding darkness instead of the endless red glow of warning runes. But memory is a cruel gift in this place, and I have learned that the past is merely another form of torture, refined by the Imperium's infinite capacity for suffering. They tell us we are blessed, they tell us we serve. They do not tell us what we have become, though I suspect they know we can still remember enough to understand our own damnation. The cell where they kept us before the processing was 3 meters wide and 4 meters deep, carved from rockcrete so old that moisture had begun to seep through the walls in dark patches that looked like continents on some forgotten map. 14 of us occupied that space, though the number changed, sometimes growing when the guards threw in another trembling body, sometimes shrinking when someone was pulled out and never returned. We learned not to ask questions. We learned not to speak at all, actually, because words seemed to accelerate the process, drawing attention to ourselves in ways that inevitably led to selection. The silence was its own kind of death, a slow suffocation of the soul that preceded the more literal transformations to come. They had arrested me on the 3rd day of the 9th month, though I cannot remember which year any more. Time loses meaning in the depths of a penal ship, where the light never changes, and the only clock is the rhythm of your own deteriorating body. My crime was apostasy, though I had merely questioned, not denied the nature of the Emperor's divinity during a sanctioned discussion period at the shrine where I worked as a record keeper. Someone reported me. Perhaps it was Malus, the underpriest who envied my position, or perhaps it was Sister Velia, who had always regarded me with suspicion because I sometimes smiled when the liturgies grew too long. It did not matter. In the Imperium, intent and action are indistinguishable from suspicion and accusation. The Arbites came at dawn, their boots hammering against my door with the finality of a death sentence, and by midday I was in chains, being shuttled toward the prison ship that orbited our world like a malevolent moon. The ship itself was called the Penance of Saints, though there was nothing holy about it except in the most terrible sense of the word. It was a vast, Gothic monstrosity, all spires and buttresses and gargoyles that leered down at us as we were herded from the shuttle bay into the processing levels. Everything was metal cold, unyielding, indifferent metal that seemed to leach the warmth from your body on contact. The walls were adorned with bas-reliefs depicting scenes of judgment and punishment, the Emperor's angels casting down the unworthy into flames that seemed to flicker in the dim lighting. Servo skulls drifted overhead, their eyeless sockets trained on us, recording every moment of our humiliation for archives that no one would ever read. The air tasted of recycled atmosphere and incense, a combination that should have been purifying but instead felt corrupt, as though the prayers themselves had gone sour in this place. They stripped us of our clothing first, then our possessions, then our identities. My name Erasmus Vale was replaced with a designation, Penitent Laborer 7743-88. The number was tattooed onto my left shoulder blade with a needle device that burned and scarred simultaneously, ensuring the marking would never fade. Around me, others wept or prayed or remained silent in the shock of their transformation from citizen to property. I remember a woman beside me, perhaps 40 years old, who kept repeating her children's names like a mantra: Cilia, Martin, Cole. Cilia, Martin, Cole. She said it perhaps 1,000 times in those first hours, until her voice grew hoarse, and then silent, and then she said it no more because something inside her had broken in a way that would never heal. The cell where they placed us was one of thousands, I later learned, arranged in concentric rings around the ship's core. We were kept in near darkness, the only light coming from a single lumen strip that flickered with the inconsistency of failing technology. The smell was overwhelming at first: unwashed bodies, waste from the communal bucket in the corner, the acrid tang of fear sweat that seems to have its own distinct odor. But the human nose is adaptable, and within days I ceased to notice it, which was perhaps the first sign of how quickly we were being transformed from people into things. We were fed once per day a grey nutrient paste dispensed through a slot in the door. It had no taste beyond a vague chemical bitterness, but we consumed it desperately, knowing that survival even in this hellish existence was still preferable to whatever came next. The woman who had spoken her children's names died on the 7th day. She simply stopped moving during the night, curled in the corner where she had made her small territory. No one touched her body. No one called for the guards. We simply moved away from her, pressing ourselves against the opposite wall, until the smell of death became distinct enough that the guards noticed and dragged her out. They replaced her with a man who had been a scribe in the administratum, accused of altering a tithe record. He lasted 11 days before his mind broke completely, and he began to speak in tongues, long streams of numbers and codes that meant nothing to anyone, least of all himself. The guards took him away too. Though not to death, we could hear him screaming in some distant part of the ship for hours afterward, and then there was silence more terrible than any scream. They came for me on the 19th day. I had not slept well, none of us did, in that place, but I was awake when the cell door opened with a grinding of ancient mechanisms. 2 guards stood in the threshold, their faces hidden behind mirror-visored helms, their hands resting on shock mauls that crackled with barely contained energy. One of them pointed at me, a gesture so casual it might have been selecting fruit at a market, and spoke my designation, Penitent Laborer 7743-88, processing, now. I stood, my legs trembling from disuse and fear, and walked toward them. Behind me, I could feel the eyes of the others, wondering if I was being taken to death or something worse. I wondered the same thing. The corridors of the Penance of Saints were labyrinthine, a maze of passages that twisted and doubled back on themselves with no apparent logic. We walked for what seemed like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing based on my fear rather than any objective measure. The walls were decorated with scrolls of parchment, each one inscribed with the crimes of the ship's inhabitants, thousands upon thousands of sins catalogued with the Imperium's obsessive attention to detail. I saw my own among them, eventually. Erasmus Vale, Record Keeper 3rd Class, Question Divine Nature, of Emperor Shrine World, Galentia the 7. 18 words that summarized a life, reduced a human being to a database entry, a problem to be processed and resolved. We arrived at a chamber that was different from anything I had seen before. It was vast, cathedral-like in its proportions, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow far above. The walls were lined with machinery cogitators, surgical devices, vat tanks filled with murky fluid, and things I could not identify, their purposes too alien or too terrible to comprehend. In the center of the room was a throne-like chair, clearly designed for restraint, with straps and clamps and neural links that dangled like the tentacles of some mechanical creature. Around the chair stood 3 figures in the red robes of the Mechanicus, their faces hidden behind masks that made them look more machine than human. One of them turned toward me as I entered, and I caught a glimpse of the optical lenses that had replaced its eyes, whirring and clicking as they focused on me with the cold precision of a targeting array. Penitent Laborer 7743 bis 88, it said, its voice crackling through a vox grill that robbed it of any human warmth. You have been judged apostate. Your crime is doubt. Doubt is the seed of heresy. Heresy is the root of damnation. The Imperium, in its infinite mercy, offers you redemption through service. You will serve. You will serve forever. You will serve without thought, without question, without the burden of consciousness that led you to sin. This is the Emperor's gift to you. Do you accept? I wanted to scream, to refuse, to beg for any other fate. But the words caught in my throat, strangled by fear, and the absolute certainty that my answer meant nothing. They would do this regardless of my consent. The question was merely a formality, a final cruelty to remind me that I had once possessed agency, even as that agency was being stripped away forever. I nodded, a tiny, pathetic gesture, and one of the guards seized my arm and dragged me toward the chair. The restraints closed around me with brutal efficiency. My wrists, my ankles, my chest, my throat, each one locked into place with a click that sounded like the closing of a tomb. I could not move, could barely breathe, as the straps constricted around me. One of the tech priests approached, holding a device that looked like a neural interface cable, its end bristling with needles that would puncture my skull and connect directly to my brain. I understood then, in a moment of perfect, crystalline horror, what they intended to do. Not death, not even imprisonment. They were going to erase me, to hollow out everything that made me Erasmus Vale and replace it with servitor programming, turning me into a biological machine that would serve the Imperium without thought or feeling or memory. The process is irreversible, the tech priest said, and there might have been something like regret in its mechanical voice. Or perhaps I only imagined it because I needed to believe that somewhere in this vast, cruel machine of empire there existed a shred of human compassion. Your higher functions will be suppressed, your autonomy will be eliminated. You will retain basic motor skills and the ability to follow simple commands, but you will no longer possess self-awareness. You will not suffer, you will not fear, you will not be you. In this way, the Emperor forgives you. The cable descended toward my skull, and I closed my eyes, trying to hold on to one final thought, one last assertion of my existence. I thought of my mother's face, the way she had looked when she kissed my forehead before I left for the Shrine City to begin my training. I thought of the small garden I had kept in my quarters, the scent of lavender and rose, growing things in a galaxy that seemed determined to cultivate only death. I thought of a sunset I had witnessed once, standing on the monastery walls, watching as the light bled across the horizon like a wound in the sky. These memories were all I had, and they were about to be taken from me, filed away in some archive of neural tissue that would continue to exist, but could no longer be accessed by anything resembling me. The needles pierced my skull with a sensation like ice and fire simultaneously. I tried to scream, but the restraint around my throat prevented it, reducing my agony to a strangled gasp. My vision went white, then red, then a darkness, so complete it seemed to have texture. A darkness I could feel pressing against my consciousness from all sides. I heard voices, the tech priests chanting in binaric cant, the guards muttering prayers to the Omnissiah, and beneath it all, a humming that might have been machinery or might have been the sound of my own brain being rewritten, neurons firing in patterns they had never followed before, creating new pathways while burning away the old. The pain was indescribable, so far beyond anything I had experienced that my mind had no framework for processing it. I existed in that moment as pure suffering, a scream given flesh, a consciousness trapped in the process of its own annihilation. And then, impossibly, something went wrong. I felt it in the sudden change in the tech priests chanting, the shift from ritual certainty to confusion. The machinery around me began to whine, a high-pitched sound that grew louder and more urgent, and I heard one of them shout something in Gothic. Neural rejection. The interfaces. The sentence ended in a burst of static and sparks, and suddenly the pain intensified beyond what I had thought possible. My body convulsed against the restraints, every muscle contracting simultaneously, and I tasted blood in my mouth as I bit through my tongue. The world became a kaleidoscope of agony and sensation, and I felt something inside me tear, not physically but metaphysically, as though my soul itself were being shredded by incompatible machinery. When I woke, and I did wake, which was perhaps the cruelest part, I was no longer in the throne chair. I was lying on a cold metal floor in a dimly lit chamber, my body intact but wrong in ways I could not immediately identify. I tried to move and discovered that my limbs responded, but sluggishly, as though they were no longer entirely mine. I raised my hands to my face and felt smooth metal where there should have been flesh on my temples. The neural interface had been installed, or partially installed. I could feel it as a foreign presence in my head, a pressure that pulsed with each heartbeat. But something had survived. I was still me. Still Erasmus Vale. Still capable of thought and memory and fear. The conversion had failed, leaving me trapped in a liminal state between human and servitor, conscious but violated, myself but no longer wholly so. I became aware of voices nearby, and I forced my head to turn toward the sound. 2 tech priests stood in the corner of the chamber, their forms silhouetted against the glow of a cogitator screen. They were speaking in low tones, but in the silence of that place their words carried clearly. Unprecedented. The rejection should not have been possible. His neural architecture is incompatible with standard servitor protocols, but the partial integration has created a hybrid state. He retains consciousness and autonomy, but the interface allows for external override and behavioral modification. We should report this to the Magos. No, the second one said, and there was something calculating in its mechanical voice. Such anomalies are better studied before being reported. If we present this as a completed success rather than a failure, we can continue to observe and experiment. The potential applications of a partially converted subject, one who retains self-awareness but can be controlled, are significant. Imagine soldiers who can think tactically but cannot refuse orders. Imagine workers who can solve problems but cannot rebel. This failure may be our greatest success. They continued talking, but I had stopped listening. The horror of my situation was unfolding before me with the clarity of a nightmare made real. I was trapped in my own body, my own mind, but no longer master of either. They could control me, manipulate me, force me to act against my will while I remained aware of every moment, every violation. I would become a puppet who could feel the strings, a prisoner who could see the bars but never escape them. The servitor conversion would have been mercy compared to this oblivion, instead of eternal, conscious servitude. But mercy was not something the Imperium offered its apostates. Days passed, or perhaps weeks without any external reference. Time became meaningless again, though in a different way than it had in the cell. I was moved to a new location, a laboratory deep within the ship's bowels where the tech priests conducted their experiments. They tested the limits of the neural interface, sending commands directly into my brain and watching as my body obeyed against my will. Simple things at first. Raise your right hand. Walk forward. Kneel. Stand. Each time, I felt the command arrive not as words but as compulsions, irresistible urges that overrode my own desires. I would try to resist, throwing all my willpower against the neural override, but my body would move anyway, betraying me with mechanical precision. The tech priests recorded everything, their optical sensors whirring with satisfaction as they refined their control methods. The worst part was not the loss of physical autonomy but the creeping realization that the interface was changing me in more subtle ways. I began to notice thoughts that did not feel like my own, impulses toward obedience and acceptance that arose unbidden. When the tech priests gave me commands, a part of me, a part that was growing larger each day, wanted to obey, felt satisfaction in compliance, experienced pleasure in serving. This, I understood, was how they would ultimately win. They did not need to erase me completely. They merely needed to reshape me, adding new layers of programming and conditioning, until the original Erasmus Vale was buried beneath so much behavioral modification that he might as well not exist. I was being overwritten slowly, file by file, until nothing authentic remained. Other subjects arrived in the laboratory, other failed conversions who had retained some measure of consciousness. There were 5 of us eventually, each displaying different degrees of hybrid existence. A woman designated penitent laborer 3309-12 could speak but only in carefully structured sentences, as though her speech centers had been locked into predefined patterns. A man whose designation I never learned had lost all emotional effect, his face frozen in a neutral expression even as tears ran down his cheeks. His body knew it should be crying, but his mind no longer understood why. Another had been converted partially into a combat servitor, his right arm replaced with a weapon mount, but the integration had failed in such a way that he could feel phantom pain from the missing limb, an endless agony that no amount of medication could touch. We did not speak to each other much. What was there to say? We were each alone in our private hells, too damaged to offer comfort, too aware to accept platitudes. The tech priest's experiments grew more invasive. They began testing behavioral modification through direct neural stimulation, creating associations between certain thoughts and pain or pleasure. They would ask me questions about the Emperor, monitoring my neural activity, and whenever I produced a response that indicated doubt or questioning, they would trigger a pulse of agony through the interface. Conversely, orthodox thoughts, proper devotion, unquestioning faith, these were rewarded with sensations of euphoria. It was classical conditioning at its most brutal, and I could feel it working despite my awareness of the manipulation. My mind began to flinch away from forbidden thoughts before the punishment could arrive, preemptively censoring itself to avoid pain. They were training me to be my own inquisitor, to police my own consciousness more effectively than any external authority ever could. Months passed. I know this because I began to mark time by the ship's work cycles, counting the periods of increased activity when the servitors and prisoners were put to labor. My body had changed, further additional implants had been installed, cybernetic enhancements that improved my physical capabilities while further eroding my humanity. My left eye had been replaced with an optical sensor that fed directly into my visual cortex, providing enhanced clarity, but also overlaying everything with targeting reticules and data readouts that I could not dismiss. My lungs had been augmented with respirator units that allowed me to survive in hostile environments, but made my breathing sound mechanical, each inhalation and exhalation accompanied by a soft whirring. My hands had been fitted with interface ports that allowed me to connect directly to machinery, experiencing their operations as extensions of my own nervous system. They gave me work, finally, assigned me to maintain the ship's cogitator systems in a section that was considered too delicate for standard servitors, but too menial for human tech acolytes. I spent my days, or what passed for days, interfacing with machine spirits, diagnosing problems, conducting repairs. The work should have been mindless, but the neural interface made it something else entirely. When I connected to the machinery, I felt myself spreading out, my consciousness diffusing through circuits and data conduits, experiencing the ship as a vast mechanical entity that I was simultaneously inside and a part of. I could feel the prayers of the crew as electrical signals, the pain of the prisoners as fluctuations in the atmospheric processing systems, the slow decay of the vessel itself as entropy working its way through every system. It was during these interfaces that I began to understand the true nature of the Imperium's relationship with technology, with servitors, with beings like myself. We were not separate from the machines, we were transitional forms, bridges between flesh and steel, consciousness gradually being translated into more reliable code. The Mechanicus did not see human beings as sacred in themselves, but as raw material, biological substrate that could be refined and improved through mechanical augmentation. The servitor conversion was not punishment but transcendence in their eyes, a shedding of the weaknesses of flesh in favor of the purity of function. That my conversion had failed was irrelevant. I was still being perfected, still ascending toward some posthuman ideal that regarded suffering and consciousness as bugs to be eliminated rather than features to be preserved. I think it was around the 6th month that I began to lose my grip on my original identity. The behavioral conditioning was working too well, rewiring my neural pathways in ways that the failed servitor conversion had not managed. I found myself thinking thoughts that Erasmus Vale would never have entertained, that the Emperor was truly divine, that doubt was weakness, that suffering served a purpose in the Imperium's grand design. These thoughts felt authentic, rising from within rather than being imposed from without, but I knew with the small, shrinking part of me that remained unconditioned that they were manufactured, that I was watching myself be transformed into an enthusiastic accomplice to my own destruction. The horror was that I could not stop it. I could see the process happening, could catalogue each shift in my psychology, but awareness provided no protection. The interface bypassed rational thought, operating directly on the substrates of emotion and instinct. They brought me a new subject to work with, a young woman who had been arrested for possessing forbidden literature. She had been beautiful once, I could tell, but the prison and processing had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hair shaved to stubble, her body marked with the same identification tattoos that covered my own skin. The tech priests wanted me to assist in her conversion, to use my hybrid nature to interface with the servitor throne and optimize the neural stripping process. I refused at first, the command dying in my throat as something deep inside me rebelled against participating in another person's annihilation. But the tech priests simply activated the interface, and I felt my resistance melt away, replaced by a calm acceptance of my assigned task. My hands moved without my conscious direction, checking connections, adjusting settings, preparing the machinery that would destroy her mind. She looked at me as they strapped her into the throne, and in her eyes I saw recognition not of me specifically, but of what I represented. She was looking at her own future, seeing the half-human thing she would become if the conversion failed as mine had. Her lips moved, forming words I could not hear over the hum of the machinery, but I could read the shape of them. Please. Just that single word, a prayer to whatever fragment of humanity might remain in me. I wanted to help her, wanted to refuse, wanted to sabotage the equipment, so that she might die cleanly rather than face the extended agony of partial conversion. But my body would not obey my will. My hands completed their preparations, my voice confirmed readiness to the tech priests, and I stood aside as they activated the throne and began the process of erasing her. Her screams echoed through the laboratory for hours, and they echo through my memory still, joining the chorus of agonies that have become the soundtrack of my existence. I wanted to cover my ears, to shut out the sound, but the interface held me in place, forcing me to witness and participate in her destruction. When it was over, she lay slumped in the throne, her eyes vacant, a thin line of drool running from her mouth. Another servitor, another success, another soul added to the Imperium's vast machinery, but as they released her from the restraints and led her away, I saw her hand twitch, just slightly, a movement that seemed to have intention behind it. The conversion had failed, just as mine had. She would wake soon to find herself trapped in the same liminal hell, conscious but controlled, aware but unable to resist. I broke that night, though breaking is perhaps the wrong word. What remained of Erasmus Vale simply ceased to struggle, surrendered to the inevitable, accepted that resistance was not merely futile but impossible. The interface had won, the conditioning had worked, and I had been transformed into exactly what the tech priests had intended, a self-aware tool, a thinking machine, a being that could experience suffering but could no longer meaningfully oppose the forces that caused it. I continued to work, continued to assist in conversions, continued to maintain the ship's systems with mechanical efficiency, but something had shifted inside me, a final acceptance that made the whole process easier. I stopped trying to hold on to my memories of who I had been, stopped using Erasmus Vale's name even in the privacy of my own thoughts. I was penitent laborer 7,743 to 88, a designation and a function, and nothing more. Years passed. I know this only because I began to notice patterns in the ship's operations, cycles that repeated with such regularity that they could only mark longer periods of time. Prisoners arrived and were processed, worked until they died or were converted, and were replaced by new prisoners in an endless, grinding cycle. I rose through the hierarchy of the partially converted, becoming a supervisor of sorts, directing other hybrid servitors in their maintenance tasks. The tech priests seemed pleased with my development, noting in their reports that I exhibited optimal compliance despite retained consciousness. I had become their proof of concept, evidence that the servitor process could be refined to preserve useful cognitive functions while eliminating troublesome autonomy. I trained new subjects as they arrived, teaching them how to interface with machinery, how to suppress their resistance to neural commands, how to accept their new existence. Some adapted quickly, their personalities crumbling within weeks. Others took longer, clinging desperately to their former identities, even as the conditioning ground them down. I felt nothing watching their transformations, not sympathy, not horror, not even the grim satisfaction that might have indicated some remaining capacity for cruelty. I had become purely functional, a biological automaton carrying out its programming with neither enthusiasm nor reluctance. The tech priests had succeeded in creating something that might have been worse than a standard servitor, a being that knew it was enslaved but could not care about its enslavement. But consciousness, even damaged and constrained consciousness, is persistent in ways that no amount of conditioning can fully suppress. Small rebellions became possible, tiny acts of resistance so subtle that the interface could not detect or prevent them. When I trained new subjects, I would sometimes find ways to ease their suffering, adjusting their neural settings to minimize pain during interface sessions, teaching them meditation techniques that helped them compartmentalize their awareness, sharing strategies for preserving fragments of identity beneath the layers of programming. These acts of kindness, if they could be called that, were possible only because they did not directly contradict my primary directives. The interface prevented overt rebellion but could not eliminate compassion that manifested as improved efficiency in my assigned tasks. I also began to notice anomalies in the ship itself, small irregularities that suggested the penance of saints was not as eternal and unchanging as I had believed. Systems were failing with increasing frequency, requiring repairs that suggested centuries of accumulated damage rather than years. The walls showed signs of corrosion that should not have been possible in a properly maintained vessel. The servo skulls were older models, their components dating back to manufacturing periods I recognized from my studies as a record-keeper periods that had ended before I was born. The ship was ancient, I realized, and dying, its systems sustained by increasingly desperate measures and the labor of beings like myself who would continue to work until they collapsed and were recycled into the same mechanisms they had maintained. I shared this observation with another hybrid servitor, a former naval officer whose conversion had left him with enhanced analytical capabilities but no ability to initiate action without external commands. He confirmed my suspicions, adding details I had not noticed. The ship's orbit was decaying, its position relative to the nearby planet shifting in ways that indicated failing thrust systems. The penance of saints was falling, slowly but inexorably, toward the gravity well that would eventually tear it apart. When I asked how long we had, he calculated silently for a moment, his optical implants flickering through data, then said, 17 years, 4 months, approximately. The orbit will become unsustainable before then, but catastrophic structural failure should not occur until we enter the upper atmosphere. 17 years. I had perhaps 2 decades of functional existence remaining, all of it to be spent in this twilight state, maintaining systems on a doomed vessel, creating more hybrid servitors who would share my fate. The knowledge should have brought despair, or perhaps grim satisfaction. At least there was an end, an absolute termination beyond which even the Imperium's cruelty could not reach. But I felt neither. The interface and conditioning had eroded my capacity for strong emotion, leaving behind only a muted awareness of my situation, a detached understanding that provoked no particular response. I was curious about how it would end, the way one might be curious about the conclusion of a story, but I felt no personal investment in my own survival or destruction. The woman they had processed in front of me, the one with the forbidden literature, found me during a maintenance shift in one of the ship's deeper sections. She moved with the jerky, uncertain gait of the recently converted, her body not yet fully acclimated to the augmentations and neural override systems. But when she spoke, her voice was her own, still carrying the inflections and personality that the servitor conversion had failed to erase. "You helped me," she said, and there was accusation in the words rather than gratitude. "During the conversion, you adjusted something. I felt it. You made it worse. You made sure I would stay conscious, made sure I wouldn't disappear completely. Why? Why would you do that to me?" I turned to face her, my optical sensor automatically focusing and recording her features for later analysis. She was right, I realized. I had modified her conversion parameters, but not consciously. The act had been performed by my hands, while my mind was locked away by the interface override. Some buried part of me, some fragment of Erasmus' veil that still existed beneath the conditioning, had reached out to save her, not understanding that salvation in this place meant prolonged suffering rather than merciful oblivion. "I don't know," I said, and the words felt true even as I recognized them as inadequate. "I don't remember making that choice. Perhaps something in me thought consciousness was worth preserving. Perhaps it was the final rebellion available to me. Or perhaps the interface simply malfunctioned, and you're ascribing intention where there was only accident." She studied me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Her human eye and optical sensor both focused on my face as though trying to find something beneath the augmentations and conditioning. "You're lying," she said finally. "Not to me, to yourself. You remember being human. You remember what it was like to have choices. And you're trying to pretend you don't, because it's easier than accepting what you've become. But I can see you. Penitent Laborer 7743-88. I can see the person you were, still there, still fighting, even if you can't." Her words struck something deep inside me, bypassing the conditioning to touch whatever core of identity still persisted. I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of grief, not for my situation, but for hers, for all of us trapped in this hellish half-existence. The interface immediately activated, flooding my system with corrective chemicals designed to suppress strong emotions. But for just a moment, I was fully present, fully myself, experiencing the totality of what had been done to us. "My name was Erasmus Vale," I heard myself say, the words emerging from some locked chamber of memory. "I was a record keeper on Galentia the Seven. I had a garden where I grew lavender. I questioned the Emperor's divinity during a discussion that was supposed to be sanctioned. They took everything from me, my life, my identity, my future, and they didn't even give me the mercy of making me forget." The moment passed, the interface reasserting control, and I felt my consciousness settling back into its constrained parameters. But something had changed. The woman, I never learned her name, never asked for it, had reminded me that there was still a person beneath the programming, still a consciousness capable of recognizing its own imprisonment. We began to meet during our shifts. finding opportunities to speak in the brief periods when we were both assigned to the same sections. She told me about her crime. She had been part of an underground literary circle that collected pre-imperial texts, old stories from before the Emperor's rise that suggested humanity had once organized itself differently. She had been naive, she admitted, thinking that studying the past could offer insights for the present. The Imperium did not tolerate such thinking. The Imperium wanted only forward motion, only obedience, only the eternal grinding present that denied any possibility of alternative existence. Together, we began to document our experiences, using the ship's lesser cogitator systems to create hidden files that recorded the testimonies of the hybrid servitors. It was a pointless exercise. No one would ever read these files, and even if they did, it would change nothing. The Imperium was too vast, too entrenched, too utterly convinced of its own righteousness to be swayed by the suffering of expendable apostates. But the act of recording felt important, a small assertion of our continued existence as thinking beings rather than mere tools. We interviewed others like us, collecting their stories in hushed voices during brief moments of unsupervised interaction. A former merchant who had been caught trading with suspected heretics, a scholar who had published research questioning the efficiency of the Ecclesiarchy's resource distribution, a soldier who had shown mercy to surrendering enemies and been denounced by his commissar. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its essential elements. Someone had thought, had questioned, had shown the smallest deviation from perfect orthodoxy, and the Imperium's machinery had seized them and ground them down until nothing remained but broken consciousness trapped in modified flesh. The penance of saints was not an aberration but a microcosm. I came to understand a concentrated example of what the Imperium did on galactic scale, transforming human beings into components of a machine that served no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The Emperor, if he still existed somewhere on distant Terra, might weep to know what had been built in his name, or perhaps he would approve, seeing in our suffering the necessary sacrifice required to sustain humanity's dominion over a hostile universe. The ship's decay accelerated as the years passed. Systems that had been marginally functional began to fail completely, requiring increasingly desperate repairs. The tech priests grew frantic, their carefully maintained composure cracking as they realized their vessel was dying and they lacked the resources to save it. They pushed us harder, demanding longer work shifts, more dangerous repairs in sections that had become structurally unsound. Hybrid servitors began to die, not from conversion complications but from simple industrial accidents falling through corroded decking, being crushed by failing machinery, suffocating when atmospheric systems failed in sealed compartments. We were being worn down, used up, consumed by the same processes we were supposed to maintain. I lost count of how many years I had been on the ship. 10, 15, 20? My body had been repaired and modified so many times that almost nothing original remained. My legs had been replaced with mechanical limbs, after a falling beam crushed the originals. My torso was more augmentation than flesh, my organs supplemented or replaced by synthetic alternatives that filtered my blood and regulated my systems with inhuman efficiency. My brain, the only part that truly mattered, the only part that made me me, remained organic, but even it was laced with neural implants that had grown into my tissue like cybernetic ivy, blurring the line between thought and programming until I could no longer distinguish between them. The woman who had confronted me died during a routine maintenance operation. The chamber she was working in suffered a catastrophic pressure loss, and she was pulled through a crack in the hull too narrow to accommodate a human body. They recovered what remained of her 3 days later, when they finally managed to seal the breach. But by then, she had been exposed to the void long enough that even her augmented systems could not sustain her. I was assigned to process her remains, to salvage the valuable components and dispose of the useless biological material. I did so mechanically, my hands performing their programmed tasks, while my mind retreated to some interior space where I did not have to acknowledge that I was dismantling someone who had been, if not a friend, then at least a fellow prisoner in this particular hell. Among her augmentations, I found something unexpected. A small data wafer, no larger than a fingernail, hidden in a sealed compartment behind her primary neural interface. It should not have been there, should not have survived the installation process, should have been detected by the regular diagnostic scans the tech priests performed. But it had, somehow, evaded all detection and remained secure in its hiding place. I palmed it before anyone could see, a movement so smooth and automatic that I hardly registered my own theft. Later, when I was alone in a service corridor, I interfaced with the wafer using my hand ports and accessed its contents. It was the archive we had created together, all the testimonies and stories we had collected from the hybrid servitors. But more than that, it was a message, addressed to no one in particular but clearly meant for anyone who might find it. She had recorded it during one of her final shifts, her voice calm and clear despite the despair of her words. To whoever finds this, we were human once. We had names and lives and choices. The Imperium took those from us, not as punishment, but as refinement, as though our autonomy was a design flaw to be corrected. They made us aware of our own enslavement, conscious witnesses to our destruction, and called it mercy. This is what the Emperor's peace looks like from below. This is what service means for those who question. Remember us. We were human once. I kept the wafer, hiding it in the same compartment where she had stored it, creating space among my own augmentations. It became a talisman, proof that we had existed as more than our designations, more than our functions. I would access it sometimes during the endless work cycles, listening to her voice and the voices of others who had recorded their testimonies. Most were dead now, casualties of the ship's deterioration or of their own augmented systems failing past the point where they could be repaired. The population of hybrid servitors was shrinking, not through conversion to full servitor status, but through simple attrition. And the tech priests no longer bothered to create replacements. We were a failed experiment, useful for a time but ultimately unsustainable, and like all failed experiments, we would be allowed to run their course until we expired. The penance of saints finally fell from orbit on a day that was like any other except for the way it ended. I was working in one of the central computational chambers when the first alarm sounded, warning of orbital decay beyond acceptable parameters. The tech priests' voices filled the Vox channels, overlapping in mechanical panic as they realized that catastrophe had become inevitable. The ship shuddered, a deep vibration that ran through every girder and cable, and I felt through my interface connections the vessel's machine spirit crying out in distress as it confronted its own mortality. Around me, other workers, hybrid servitors, standard servitors, a few human tech acolytes, continued their tasks with the blank dedication of those who knew that stopping would not prevent what was coming. The descent took hours, the ship falling in a controlled tumble as failing thrusters fought against gravity they could no longer fully oppose. I remained at my station, hands connected to the cogitator systems, experiencing the vessel's death as a cascade of failing systems and breached compartments. I felt sections depressurize, heard the screams of those caught in sudden vacuum, experienced the overload of power systems, as the tech priests diverted all available energy to maintaining the structural integrity of the core sections. It was intimate, this death, more personal than anything I had experienced as a hybrid servitor. I was not merely observing the ship's destruction but participating in it. My consciousness spread through its failing systems like a ghost haunting a collapsing house. We struck atmosphere with an impact that should have torn the vessel apart, but somehow didn't. The hull heated, metal screaming as friction converted momentum into temperature, that crept into even the shielded interior spaces. I smelled burning insulation, tasted smoke in my filtered air, felt heat radiating through the walls until the chamber became an oven. My cooling systems struggled to compensate, pumping synthetic blood through heat exchangers that glowed red with the effort. Around me, others were not so fortunate. I watched an tech acolyte burst into flames as his robes ignited, saw a servitor's synthetic flesh melt away to reveal the metal skeleton beneath. I could not help them. I could not even stop working. My hands locked into their interface with the cogitators, maintaining systems that no longer served any purpose beyond prolonging our collective agony by precious seconds. The impact, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The ship struck something ground. Water. I couldn't tell through the chaos of failing sensors, and the deceleration was brutal, but not immediately fatal. The section where I worked remained structurally intact, though the force of the landing tore my hands from the interface sockets and threw me against a wall hard enough to crack my mechanical ribs. I lay there in the darkness. The lumen strips had failed in the crash, listening to the sound of secondary explosions, collapsing corridors, and the terrified prayers of those still capable of speech. The ship was dying around us, but it was dying slowly, prolonging our awareness of the end rather than granting swift termination. I found I could still move, my mechanical limbs responding despite the damage to my torso. I pulled myself upright and began to navigate through the wreckage, following emergency lighting that flickered weakly at irregular intervals. Other survivors were doing the same, hybrid servitors and humans alike, all of us moving with the same aimless determination toward exits that probably no longer existed. The ship's corridors had become a maze of twisted metal and collapsed ceilings, each passage a gamble that might lead to escape, or to a sealed chamber where we would suffocate slowly as atmosphere leaked away. I found the tech priest who had overseen my conversion in a chamber that had partially collapsed, a beam pinning its lower body, while it frantically worked at a personal cogitator with its remaining functional arms. It looked up as I entered, its optical sensors focusing on me with something that might have been recognition. Penitent Laborer 7743-88. It said, its vox grill damaged so that its voice came out distorted and stuttering. You persist. Your resilience is admirable. The experiment was a success, in its way. You have proven that consciousness and control are not incompatible. You should be proud. I stood there, looking at the thing that had destroyed me, and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction at seeing it trapped and dying, not even the grim pleasure of witnessing justice. The conditioning had done its work too well, stripping away the capacity for such responses, but something else remained, some core of understanding that transcended both my original humanity and the programmed servitude that had been layered over it. You're dying, I said, and my voice was calm, almost gentle. The ship is dying. We're all dying, and in the end, it meant nothing. The suffering you inflicted, the identities you erased, the consciousness you trapped, all of it meaningless. The Imperium will go on without this vessel. Another penal ship will take its place. More apostates will be converted, more hybrid servitors created. Your success or failure doesn't matter. We never mattered. The tech priest's optical sensors flickered, and I thought perhaps it might have wept if it still possessed the biological mechanisms for tears. Yes, it said finally. Yes, we never mattered. But the work continues. The Imperium continues. That is enough. That must be enough. And then its systems failed entirely, the lights in its optical sensors dying, and it became just another component of the wreckage, indistinguishable from the machinery it had spent its life maintaining. I left it there and continued searching for an exit. I found one eventually, a breached section where the hull had torn open during impact, revealing a landscape I did not recognize. The ship had crashed on the prison world it had orbited, its long fall ending where it had begun, creating a crater that would probably be visible from orbit for centuries. The sky above was the color of rust, and in the distance I could see the lights of settlement, a prison camp or processing facility. Most likely, though I was too far away to determine which. I stepped out onto the surface, my mechanical legs sinking slightly into soil that seemed to be mostly ash and pulverized rock. Behind me, the penance of saints groaned and settled, pieces of it continuing to fall away like flesh from a corpse. I could hear survivors inside, their voices calling for help that would not come. I should have gone back, should have tried to rescue others, but the interface had other priorities: survival, self-preservation, continuation of function. My legs carried me away from the wreck, moving with mechanical precision across the barren landscape. I walked for what might have been days, my augmented system sustaining me without need for food or water. The prison world was as desolate as I had imagined, a place where the only structures were those built by the Imperium to contain and punish its enemies. I passed other crash survivors occasionally, both the dying and the already dead, but I did not stop to help or acknowledge them. The interface kept me moving forward, toward what destination I could not say, driven by programming I could no longer distinguish from my own will. Eventually, I was found by a patrol from one of the prison camps. They surrounded me with weapons drawn, shouting commands in Gothic that my damaged audio receptors could barely process. I raised my hands in a gesture of surrender, my interface automatically broadcasting my designation and status. They recognized what I was: a hybrid servitor from a crashed vessel, property of the Mechanicus, salvage to be recovered and put back to work. They did not ask my name. They did not care what I had been before. I was a tool, and tools existed to be used until they broke. They brought me to the camp, a sprawling complex of prefabricated structures and razor wire that stretched to the horizon. I was catalogued, repaired where necessary, and assigned to maintenance duties similar to those I had performed on the ship. The work was familiar, almost comforting in its monotony. I interfaced with cogitators, diagnosed failing systems, performed repairs in conditions that would have killed unmodified humans. The other workers, prisoners, servitors, penal laborers gave me wide berth, sensing something wrong in my hybrid nature, something that marked me as neither fully human nor fully machine but something in between, something unnatural, even by the Imperium's flexible standards. I have been here for how long? The passage of time is difficult to measure when every day is identical to the last, when your body no longer ages in ways that mark the years, when your mind has been conditioned to exist only in the perpetual present of assigned tasks. The data wafer remains hidden in my augmentations, the testimonies of those who died on the penance of saints, preserved in digital format, that will outlast any biological memory. Sometimes I access it, listening to voices of the dead, remembering that we were human once, that we had names and choices and lives before the Imperium's machinery ground us into components. I think about Erasmus Vale sometimes, about the person I was before the conversion, before the conditioning, before the interface locked away my autonomy and forced me to become complicit in my own enslavement. He seems like a stranger now, someone I might have known briefly but whose features have faded in memory until only the vaguest impression remains. He questioned the Emperor's divinity, and for that question, that single, tentative exploration of doubt, he was destroyed so thoroughly that even his capacity to grieve his own destruction was taken from him. The Imperium calls this mercy. The Imperium calls this justice. The Imperium calls this redemption through service. I know now what they do not teach in the schola, what the priests do not preach from their pulpits, what the propaganda does not mention in its endless hymns to humanity's glorious destiny among the stars. The Imperium does not merely punish apostasy, it devours it, consuming the questioner and regurgitating something that wears their face, but lacks their soul. We are the forgotten, the expendable, the warnings that exist to terrify the faithful into continued faith. We are the logical conclusion of a system that values obedience above humanity, function above consciousness, eternal service above the dignity of the individual, and we are legion. For every hybrid servitor like myself, there are thousands of full servitors, millions of penal laborers, billions of citizens who serve the Imperium with consciousness intact, but autonomy constrained by social conditioning, nearly as effective as any neural interface. We are all of us being converted, slowly or quickly, willingly or by force, into components of a machine that grinds forward through the ages, consuming everything in its path. The only difference is how aware we are of the process, how much of our original consciousness remains to bear witness to our own transformation. This is what it means to be an apostate in the Imperium of Man, not execution, which would be mercy, not imprisonment, which would be simple, but transformation, conversion, the gradual erosion of everything you are, until you become a living reminder of what happens to those who question, who doubt, who dare to imagine that things could be different. We are made into object lessons, our continued existence more valuable as warning than our deaths could ever be. And we are aware, terribly aware, of every moment of our damnation. I do not know how long I will continue. My biological components are failing, my augmented systems designed for short-term use, rather than the decades they have sustained me. Eventually, something will break that cannot be repaired. Some critical system will fail beyond the ability of the prison camp's tech acolytes to restore. When that happens, I will become a full servitor, my brain extracted and installed in some other chassis, my consciousness finally suppressed beneath total neural override. Or perhaps I will simply die, my organic components giving out, while my mechanical parts continue to function for a few seconds longer, creating a final, absurd moment where my body works, but my mind has already fled. Either way, the Imperium will continue. The penal camps will continue to operate. The prison ships will continue to orbit. The conversions will continue to transform questioners into servitors, or hybrid servitors, or whatever other variations the Mechanicus devises, in its endless refinement of the process. My story is not unique, not special, not worthy of remembrance by anyone except myself. I am one among countless millions who have asked the wrong questions and paid the price for intellectual curiosity in a civilization that has elevated willful ignorance to a virtue. But I remember, despite the conditioning, despite the interface, despite everything they have done to suppress my consciousness and bend it to their purposes, I remember being Erasmus Vale. I remember questioning. I remember the moment when thought became crime, when intellectual exploration became heresy, when I stopped being human and started becoming whatever this is. And in remembering, I remain in some small way human, remain capable of bearing witness to what has been done, remains able to say with certainty that this is wrong, even if that certainty changes nothing, saves no one, matters to no one but myself. This is my testimony, recorded in the brief moments between assigned tasks when the interface's grip loosens slightly and I can think thoughts that are entirely my own. This is my witness to what the Imperium does to its apostates, to what becomes of those who doubt in a civilization built on unquestioning faith. This is my proof that I existed, that I was human, that I was more than my designation and my function. And if no one ever hears it, if this recording is lost when my systems finally fail, if it achieves nothing beyond allowing me to assert my continued existence for a few more moments, even that would be enough. It would have to be enough, because in the Imperium of Man, for those of us who have questioned and been caught, even the smallest assertion of self is an act of rebellion, a reminder that consciousness persists despite all efforts to extinguish it, that humanity endures, even when humanity has been mechanically excised and replaced with programming and implants, and behavioral conditioning that turns autonomy into automation. I was Erasmus Vale. I questioned the Emperor's divinity, and for that I was destroyed. But not completely. Never completely. Because they needed me to remain aware, needed me to understand what had been done to me, needed me to serve as both laborer and lesson, both tool and testament. This is the Imperium's mercy, its justice, its redemption. This is what apostasy costs in the dark millennium, where there is only war, only service, only the endless grinding present that admits no past and promises no future beyond more of the same. I am still here. I am still aware, and that awareness, painful as it is, constrained as it is, violated as it is, remains mine. They have taken everything else. But this tiny, battered, diminished consciousness that can still recognize itself and mourn what it has become, this they could not fully extinguish, no matter how hard they tried. And so I continue, in the way that all the Imperium's broken things continue, serving purposes I did not choose, performing functions I cannot refuse, existing in the perpetual twilight between human and machine, between consciousness and programming, between life and whatever this is. The camps stretch to the horizon, the work never ends, the interface ensures compliance, and somewhere, in the deepest core of my being, in the last untouched substrate of thought and memory and self, Erasmus Vale still screams, but no one hears. No one ever hears. That is perhaps the Imperium's greatest cruelty, not the conversion itself, but the certainty that your suffering means nothing, changes nothing, matters to no one. You are made into an example that no one studies, a warning that no one heeds, a testament that no one reads. You exist to serve, and when you can no longer serve, you will be recycled into components that will serve in your place, and the cycle will continue, eternal and pointless, as all the Imperium's cycles, grinding forward through the millennia toward no destination except its own perpetuation. This is the fate of apostates. This is what awaits those who question. This is the Imperium's peace, its justice, its mercy. Remember us, if anyone ever finds this recording. Remember that we were human once. Remember that we asked questions, and for that crime we were transformed into these twilight things, neither alive nor dead, neither free nor fully enslaved, but trapped in some horrible middle ground where consciousness persists only to experience its own powerlessness. Remember us. We were human once.